Hey folks, welcome to the highly anticipated video about my 1967 Peterbilt 351. At least it's highly anticipated by a number of you guys out there that have reached out to me on social media and here on YouTube to do a video about this truck. So this truck actually makes quite a few appearances in my other videos, and that's simply because I use it a lot. Now, before we get into the history and the build of this truck, I need to kind of point out that this truck itself has actually gone through a couple of phases of build or rebuild. And so I might reference some stuff as, phase one or as we got into part two, but it'll make sense as we go along, I think. Before I get into the whole history of me and this truck, I had actually documented the whole build of this truck from the point that I got it clear up until how it sits basically right now. Very detailed build on a couple of bulletin board style forums, both pirate4x4.com and then an old truck forum. It was called Just Old Trucks. Now, unfortunately, both of those documented builds are completely gone. The entire old trucks forum is completely gone. And for some reason, my build thread on Pirate 4x4 must have been deleted or lost in a changeover, something. I cannot find a trace of that build nowhere on Google or on Pirate itself. So, unfortunately, a lot of the pictures are gone because of that. So when I started building this truck, I was actually using PhotoBucket to save all of the pictures of the build and the process of putting this truck back together. And I was sharing those pictures from PhotoBucket to both of those forums. Now, later on in the build, like phase two part of the build, I had switched over to just uploading those photos directly to the forums instead of hosting them through PhotoBucket. And the reason for not using PhotoBucket was it just became harder to use. And then they were actually wanting to charge you money to host those pictures. Now, fortunately for me, even after the photos were lost or both the build threads were lost, I was able to get on PhotoBucket and kind of steal all of my pictures back. So I have, hundreds of pictures of working on this truck. So in this video, I will be able to, poke in pictures that I've actually recovered and been able to save on the first half of the build at least. Unfortunately, all of the pictures from the second half or phase two of the project have all pretty much been gone with those build threads. Now, by that time, I had joined Facebook, and I had shared a few pictures of the process of switching this truck over. So I'll be able to plug those pictures in as we talk about that part of the process. But you will definitely notice that there are considerably less pictures as we get farther along in the truck build. Now, to tell the story of where I started with this truck, we have to go back to the beginning. Now, I'm not going to go as far back as what I've used over the years to tow my, race vehicles or competition vehicles. Just know that I have used everything from a piece together, late 70s Ford pickup, all the way up to buying a brand new 2003 Ford Power Stroke. And there was a whole bunch of borrowing my dad's pickup in between there to get by. However, sometime right around, I believe 2011, I decided that I wanted to put together an old semi-truck, preferably a Peterbilt. They always caught my eye. And just so happened, there was actually a 1971 289 Peterbilt. So that particular truck had the same cab as this. It was a wide nose, like a 359, but a single axle, designated the 289. It was a pretty cool old truck, had a 335 Cummins and a 13 speed in it. Kind of had a line on that truck, but I didn't pursue that thing really too hard because at the time I was just looking for trucks. And at the time while I was looking at that truck, I actually ran across a Craigslist ad in Northern California for a 1961 Peterbilt 281. Now, for some reason, as soon as I seen that ad and seen the pictures of the truck, I just pretty much immediately decided that I wanted the narrow nose butterfly hood. Looking back now, a tilt hood, a 359 is a whole bunch easier to work on. But at the time, I was just dead set that I had to have the butterfly hood. No change in my mind at that point. So I made the trip over to Shingletown. My wife and I went over and we took a look at this truck. The ad read, and it was a 1961 Peterbilt 281 with a 350 small cam Cummins and a 10-speed. You could tell in the pictures that it had a water tank on it. And once we got up there, I talked to the owner of the truck and his wife, which were extremely nice people. Now, when I got over there, the owner of the truck's name was Paul. and he shared a lot of the history that he knew about the truck and everything that he did to it while he owned it. So originally the truck was a PG&E truck. Paul and his brother bought it from PG&E, and they used it as a small tractor to tow a dozer on a lowboy for their construction company. So even though it was a single rear axle, had a fifth wheel plate, it was considered a tractor. Now, eventually, over time, he ended up buying the truck out from his brother, and then he converted it over to a dump box. Now, at that time in California, to have a not be a tractor, to actually be a truck with a dump box on it, it needed front brakes. So he took the truck down to, there was a wrecking yard in Sacramento. It sounds like he did quite a bit of business with those guys. He had them put a new front axle under it, so it had front brakes. And then later on through the years, he said he wore the engine out. So the original 262 that was in the truck pretty much just got tuckered out. And rather than freshen it up, he bought a good running 350 small cam Cummins and just bolted it right in. You know, it's a direct fit. Both of them are 855 cubic inches. So there was no issues there. That's how that old truck ended up with the 350 small cam. After using the truck as a dump truck for a number of years, towing his backhoe around, he eventually upgraded to a newer dump truck. And then he ended up taking the dump box off of the 281, putting a water tank on it with a fire pump, and then contracted it out for fire duty. And that is where the truck spent the last 7 years of his ownership. Was just moving from location to location and basically just sitting in the woods. Now, even though the tank and the fire pump were 7 years old, had been, on contract duty for 7 years, they both looked brand new. They literally had very little use on them. I think the pump probably was started and run just to be certified every year. That was about it. Now, none of that meant anything to me because I don't need a water truck. However, any of that stuff that I could sell once I got the truck here back home, that just helped my cause. Now, if I remember correctly, I believe Paul wanted $7,000 or $7,500 for this truck. And I asked him if he would take half at that time, hold the truck for me for a couple of weeks, and then I would pay the other half when I come up and pick the truck up. I mostly just needed a little bit of time to do some paperwork. I needed to finish getting my CDL, and then also I needed to get the paperwork, as far as permitting and insurance and everything, so I could drive the truck back here. At that time, I didn't really have a good means of hauling something this big. So a couple weeks later, the wife and I loaded up in the car. A friend of ours went up there with me. He was actually held a CDL license, and I only had a permit at the time. So for me to legally drive the truck, I had to have a CDL license holding occupant with me. So we went up there. Paul had the truck fueled up. Everything was topped off. All the lights worked. Everything was pretty much ready to go. So we jumped in the truck and drove the thing all the way back here to Golconda, Nevada, about 300 miles, I think that trip is. No issues with the truck, really. It ran pretty good. And it just, once we got it here, pretty much just parked it here in the yard until it was time to get started on it. Now, before actually digging into this project, I had to get a little bit of help for what I wanted to accomplish with this truck. So at the time, I had a friend of mine that lived down the street here. Cliff is his name. He's an amazing body guy, and I knew that I was going to need his help because this truck, when I got it, was pretty beat. It was in pretty rough shape. So I went down there, talked to him about getting this truck in primer so I could go back together with it, and at least it would be straight. So when I got time, I could paint the truck and make it make it nice kind of at my leisure. So once Cliff and I figured out a plan, I just got busy with disassembling the truck. The water tank and the pump, all of that came off of the truck, and then it got sold. And then I actually just started stripping paint. The truck had been painted a couple of times, and I needed to get all of that off. And the end goal was just to get it clear down to the bare aluminum. As I had mentioned, the truck itself was pretty rough. The driver's side right here had one of the original steel fenders on it. The passenger side had an aluminum 379 fender. The driver's door was pretty beat. And then the driver's cab, the rear cab corner had been replaced. It was just pop riveted on there. The back cab wall actually had a spot that was buckled in it, probably the same damage at the time that the cab corner was damaged. And then the caps, the corners of the roof caps right up here, right up there. Yep, that's it. Those were beat as well, probably from the time that it spent being a dump truck. So those of you guys that are watching this that are Peterbilt guys, you're probably gonna notice that that thing has the wrong cab on it. If it's a 1961 Peterbilt 281, It should not have a Unilite cab. However, the truck that I bought had the small window Unilite cab. So honestly, I have no idea how many times that truck got wrecked. Paul never mentioned anything about that, so I'm gonna assume that that probably happened when it was a PG&E truck. It probably actually got wrecked bad enough that they recabbed the truck, and then it probably got damaged and repaired a number of times after that. So once the truck was stripped down far enough, I needed to look into a couple of issues that I was gonna have to deal with. First of all, the drive from Shingletown back here to the shop was about 55 miles an hour due to the direct 10 speed. And then I believe that rear end had like 410s or 456s in it. So it was no speed demon, that's for sure. So I either had to figure out something with the transmission, add an auxiliary box with an overdrive, or do something different with the gear ratio. Well, another friend of mine in Winnemucca here, he let me know that he actually had a really big heavy duty rear differential, and it had 307:1 gear ratio, and it was on a Freightliner Airliner air ride suspension. So that was really intriguing, and the best part was he only wanted $600 for the whole mess. So I bought that from him, hauled it into my buddy does all my powder coating and sandblasting, and had him strip everything down, just clear to bare metal. Now, once we knew that this thing was going to be, pretty much completely disassembled for paintwork and then rear suspension, all of that stuff, it came in the shop, and I continued stripping the truck down. At one point, this thing was actually sitting in the shop on jack stands, and the only thing that was in there was a cab that was completely stripped of all wiring, all interior parts, all the plumbing, the floorboard, everything. 2 frame rails, the engine, transmission, the front axle, and what was left of the radiator up on the front. Everything out the back, there was just 2 frame rails sticking out there with a couple of air tanks hanging out down below them. And that's when Cliff and I started working on our own respective parts of the project. Now, at that time, Cliff was working the opposite rotation that I was. So when I was at work on my 4 or 5 days on, he was on his 4 or 5 days off. So while I was at work, he would come over here to my shop and work on the bodywork. Then when he would go back to work for his 4 or 5 days on, I would be on days off, so then I would work on the mechanical side of the truck. And it was kind of interesting because basically Cliff started at the front of the truck and started working his way back. And I started at the back of the truck and started working my way forward. I started with the rear suspension and basically just chose a factory hole in each frame rail that was a matching pair of holes, used those for a measuring point, and measured off of that to set the rear suspension up. Bunch of drilling, bunch of filling holes, got the Freightliner Airliner to where it would bolt in, and then the rear differential came in. Cliff started at the radiator, straightening out the top tank on the radiator, all of the shrouding, whatnot, and then he went to work on the cab itself. So the cab needed quite a bit of work, like I said, in those upper corners up there from the damage from being a dump truck. And then there was quite a bit of stuff that I had to do bodywork wise. So there was a lot of stuff that was cracked, like the cowling in the truck had several cracks, some spots that were worn really thin. There were some places where I could simply weld the cracks up. Other places I had to completely remove a section of the cowl or a section of the body and then weld in a new piece, sand it down, and then Cliff would finish it out, clean it up, and make it look like nothing ever happened there. Another thing that I did bodywork wise was actually I tackled the doors. The driver's side door was really rough, so I ended up finding another door there. And then these old trucks actually have like a striker plate, like a regular, what do they call it, a bar and striker plate style latch. The ones that were in this truck were pretty rough, so you'd actually kind of have to do the trick of holding the door latch half open while you slam it and time it just right so everything closed. I actually ended up removing all of that stuff, welding up the receiver holes and everything in the door frame itself, and then installing a bear claw style latch. And that really made a big improvement on how the doors worked on this truck. Outside of those few little projects, I didn't have a whole lot to do with the body work on the truck. Cliff would come over, work on that. He went ahead and primed and block sanded. He primed and block sanded every part of this truck 3 times. I didn't really have nothing to do with that. I was thankful to be at work while that process was going on. However, when it came time to spray paint, Cliff doesn't really care to shoot paint. He can do it and he's very good at it. But if he can get a guy that he can do the body work and they'll do their own paint work, he's plenty happy with that. So when it came time to do any paint work, I would actually take a day or two off. That way we would be here at the shop at the same time together. Then we would mask the truck off and then I would shoot the paint while he was there present helping me along. Now, as this project progressed, we had decided that since it was stripped so far down, we just as well paint the truck. There's no point in leaving it in primer and then having to go back and do paint later. So it was definitely stripped down far enough to do that. Once he got the cab and everything that was still on the truck body-wise, which really wasn't much, it was the cab and a little bit of the radiator. Once he got the body work, all of that done, and it was down to the final block sand, we left it in that stage, masked everything off that we didn't want paint on. So that was basically the top of the radiator and the cab itself. And I come in and used an industrial single stage paint and painted everything that was visible. Front axle, the engine itself, the sides of the radiator, and then the frame rails out the back, and the new suspension that I had just installed. Shortly after that, Cliff finished the final block sand on the cab. I took a day off and we got together, painted the cab, painted the interior, exterior, the visor, and the top of the radiator. While all of that was going on, I was actually shuffling a lot of parts in and back and forth to town with my buddy Warren and having him actually powder coat a lot of stuff. The wheels that I had, they were just a good deal on a set of crusty old Alcoas that had been pitted from the mag chloride that we run on the roads around here. So there's no point in trying to polish those. And I knew I didn't want the truck to have a polished finish anyway. So those crusty old wheels got sandblasted and powder coated in a satin black finish. A lot of the parts actually got powder coated satin black. Fuel tanks, the stacks, anything that I wanted contrasting, I actually had Warren do those in a shiny black color, like your fuel tank straps, the air cleaner straps, parts for the lubrifiner that hung on the side of the cab. Anything that you would normally see on a truck as chrome, I would have that done in a shiny black. Now with the frame rails painted, the engine painted, the cab is now, painted. We're not really doing any more body work or paint work on the main chunk of truck. Then I could start putting those powder coated pieces back on and get those in place. Start plumbing stuff like your fuel system and the air, all of that type of stuff. I could work on that. And in the meantime, Cliff had taken the smaller parts like the doors, the fenders, the hood, all of that stuff, and taken everything down to his shop where it actually fit in his building. And then he would work on that stuff down there. There were quite a few things that we didn't use from the original truck. Like I had mentioned, had an original steel fender on the driver's side front, and then a 379 fender, aluminum fender over on the passenger side. Obviously, those were not going to work. I did a little bit of digging around. I ended up finding a pair of fenders on eBay. I bought those, and then when they showed up, the driver's side was actually an aluminum 359 fender, which is the same as the steel one that was on the truck, physically the same size. And then the second fender that came from eBay was another 379 front fender. It's kind of odd how that worked. Fortunately, the driver's side front fender had a part number sticker still on it, and I was able to use that part number and piece together enough to where I could actually order a brand new aluminum 359 fender for the passenger side front. So I bought that from Peterbilt in Reno, and we had a pair of front fenders to start with, brand new, to put on the front of this truck. Now, before the front fenders got painted, I actually took them into the Ford dealership here and had them rhino line the inside here. So it was kind of that thicker rhino lining avoids the rock chips from the inside out in the paint. And then they went to Cliff's with the rest of the stuff, and he got to work with straightening all of that out and getting everything ready to paint. Another thing that I ended up doing was building one of the hood panels. One of the side hood panels were actually pretty rough shape, and it was actually easier to buy a piece of aluminum and then bead roll all the lips and edges into it, and then he prepped that for paint as well. But all of the cowling, all of this, the stuff behind the fenders, as far as those skirts and everything that go from the back of the fender to the front of the battery boxes or the fuel tanks or wherever the truck is equipped with, all of that stuff was, again, really rough on this truck. So I simply started with a sheet of 16 gauge aluminum and fabricated all new pieces to go from the backs of the fenders to the front of the battery boxes. So before all of that stuff went down to Cliff, all of that stuff was fabricated out of new pieces of material. That way, when he was working on that stuff, he wasn't just working with absolute junk. Another thing that I tackled while all of that stuff was down at Cliff's, getting body work and ready for paint, was the engine. So the engine was a 350 small cam Cummins, according to the serial number. But I noticed, when it was sitting in the yard here, that it was actually weeping a little bit of coolant between the deck and the heads. So I ended up stripping the engine down and replacing the head gaskets, and then resealed everything from the air up. Rebuilt the Jake brakes, did all that stuff. And that was just a good opportunity to do that before we started putting all this tin work back on the truck. A couple of the first parts that actually got painted at Cliff's shop were the front doors. So once they were done, I was able to bring those up here to my shop and get them bolted back on the cab. And then I ordered everything that I needed to seal up the truck itself, the cab itself. So I ordered all new weather stripping and window seals, all of that stuff. It just basically come in a bulk roll. You cut off what you need and then assemble everything. New windows. I had actual smoked safety glass. I think it's some kind of safety glass that's smoked. So there's no tint on it. It's just that dark color. And then new windshields, the new back window, everything. Had all new windows cut out for it, reassembled it. And the only thing that I didn't buy brand new to seal up the cab were actually the wing windows themselves. Those seals were about $600 a piece. So I grabbed up a couple of good used ones that I had laying around here in other doors and, finished putting the cab back together to where it was completely sealed off. At that point, I started putting the interior back together. And that entailed quite a bit of work. So I built new upper door panels because that is actually what holds the window regulators and all of that type of stuff, your door latch assemblies, your door handle assemblies. All of that was built brand new. The original stuff is a really light aluminum and they get cracked and broke up. And plus they're kind of that ugly wood grain color. So that stuff all went in the trash. I used one for a template to build a pair of new ones out of 16 gauge steel. And then they got powder coated, satin finish to match, the majority of the rest of the powder coated parts. Another addition I made while I was working on it was a vintage air AC unit. I had one of those from another project that it didn't really work out in that truck. So I had it sitting on the shelf and I was pretty determined to make it work in this truck. It was kind of a challenge to get it tucked up under the dash there, but it ended up actually turning out really clean. There was some more fabrication of parts there. I've actually got a panel in there that holds the glove box where it slides in and out. That has all the ducting built in, so when it bolts into the dash, it actually fits over with that vintage air system. The kick panels, those were all fabricated, powder coated. Another part of the interior that I really had to have in there for the most part was a 40-20-40 split bench seat out of a Ford Super Duty with the fold down center console. One of the reasons I chose that seat was because of the integrated shoulder harnesses in those seats. So it's just kind of a better, safer setup in the truck. I really needed the bench seat because about the time we started putting the truck back together, that's when Allison was born. Yeah, the Allison that you see in these videos where she's 13 years old now, that's when she was born, was when we were putting that truck together at that time. So a bench seat was pretty much necessary for a family of 3 in a truck that at the time I didn't even have the Mercury sleeper. To get that seat in this little tiny narrow cab, I actually ended up taking the mounting points off of the center console part, moving them in about 2 inches on each side, and then remounting that to the bottom of the console. So the way those seats mount into the frame, they're almost based off of that mounting point of the center console. So by moving them in 1.5 inches or 2 inches on each side, that just moved the seats in and they're just kind of squished in tighter against that console. But everything works really good. The console folds up and down. Everything works fine. I had to rework the front foam in the center console portion a little bit to clear the shifter. But outside of that, it worked out really pretty good. And then obviously there was no wiring or air plumbing in the cab itself. So all of that got replaced. All new plumbing, all new wiring. The air motors for the windshield wipers were completely deleted. I built my own custom 12-volt windshield wiper setup for it. And then obviously before bolting the seats in, we had to have a sound system in it. Your tow rig's got to have good sound. I already had a set of 10-inch Rockford Fosgates and a couple of amplifiers. We just needed a stereo to mount up there above the windshield where the factory radio would be. I got that, put a couple of 4-inch kickers in the door panels, the custom door panels. And then I had some oddball, they were like 6x8 speakers. I just built a fixture for back in the cab corner for those. Got all of that stuff installed, new carpet, all this new wiring, got the seats in it. While doing all of the air plumbing and the wiring, the dash was pretty much completely redone as well. You know, the hard portion of the dash that is actually part of the cab, that was left alone. It was simply painted. But there is a fold down panel in these trucks. And the fold down panel consists of an aluminum frame that bolts in. It's got a hinge on the bottom and a couple of screws across the top that hold it in place. And then inside of that aluminum frame, there is an insert. And most of these trucks, that insert has a Fox wood grain setup. You've got your gauges, speedometer, tachometer, all your switch panel and everything is kind of off to the right. I'm not a big fan of the wood grain thing inside of trucks, just not my cup of tea. However, I had a pretty good chunk of carbon fiber laying around here from a previous project many, many years ago. So I took that piece of that carbon fiber, cut it to fit in place of that wood grain piece, tossed the original aluminum insert, used the carbon fiber insert, and fit all my gauges where I wanted them. Most of the stuff like your speedometer, your tachometer, the cluster of gauges, all of that went back in the stock location, but I went back together with newer stuff. I had a newer speedometer, Peterbilt speedometer. The tachometer I kept out of the truck. All of the gauges, all of those are Autometer carbon fiber series gauges. And along with those carbon fiber gauges, I went ahead and put in little lit up small rocker switches in the switch panel area. That pretty much rounded out the dash, you know, between all the wiring and plumbing, gauges, the vintage air AC setup. We pretty much had it wrapped up. The only thing that I still needed to do was the back cab liner, the headliner, and then the lower door panels. But I really never got back to that part of the project until several years later. But as the interior of the cab at this point is pretty much done. The exterior of the cab is pretty much done at that point. And it was very shortly after that, we got all of the front end pieces painted down at Cliff's place. I got them hauled back up here to the shop and just started assembling the truck. It was pretty cool to see this thing all back together in one piece, but that was only part of the project. That was just getting the truck back to the state it was, cleaned up, painted, and ready to drive down the road. However, from the cab back, still needed quite a bit of work. So the goal for the truck was actually to have a way to drive my buggy on the back of a vehicle and drive it down the road, towing our camper. Now the camper we had at the time was a Thor pack rat, so it was actually set up to haul a vehicle of some kind on a flat deck trailer behind the living quarters. So by having a truck that we can load a rig on the back of the truck and then hook onto that trailer and load another rig on the back of it, we were able to haul 2 rigs. So I needed to get started on a flatbed. Now to get started on the flatbed, I made a big order of rectangular tubing and just started fabricating. The bed itself was pretty simple. I started out with stringers sitting directly on the frame and then fitting pieces of tube in between each stringer. Now, most of the time on a flatbed, you're going to have your main rails sitting on the frame rails and then your stringers sitting on top of those. But I was really trying to get this whole thing, get the buggy sitting down as low on the chassis as I could. So by putting the stringers themselves directly on the frame rails and then fitting in between the two, I was able to save myself about 4 inches of height. The bed actually only went to the back just behind the rear tires, had small fenders up over the rear drive tires. And then from there, it just went straight down to a hitch. Well, that bed was too short for the buggy to fit on there directly, but I knew that. I just wanted to build the bed that way. Once that part of the bed was done, I come back and then built a dovetail that actually bolted to the back of that bed. So the dovetail actually made it long enough that I could load the buggy on the back of the truck. And then it only took about 5 minutes to pull a handful of bolts and slide that dovetail off the back of that bed. And then it gave you a shorter flatbed for if you needed to use the truck in a different application. By having that dovetail on the back of the bed, the back, the very farthest point back on that bed was about 3.5 or 4 feet from the back of the drive tires. So if you were going to hook onto something heavy like an equipment trailer, a pintle hitch equipment trailer or something, that would be putting a lot of leverage on that rear suspension being that far back. So I could actually take the dovetail off and hook into, your pintle hitch a matter of, a few inches from the back of the tires there. So it was just a really versatile setup to be able to do that with this truck. Once the fabrication was completed on the bed, it got painted in a another industrial paint. The actual tread plate where the buggy drove on, you know, your drive panels there, those were actually finished in a bed liner. And then the center of the bed was done in just wood. The reason for the wood was trying to deaden that tinny sound, and it actually worked really pretty good. And that's pretty much the end of phase one for the build. That was just how we used it from that point on for many, many years. Made a couple of trips up to Canada with that truck, several trips up to Bonners Ferry, Idaho, back and forth. You know, a round trip up there is about 1,500 miles. We did that for several years. And, you know, in general, we just enjoyed using the truck. At some point, and I don't remember for sure what year it was just kind of out of the blue, I decided I needed to finish the interior. So one day I ended up buying a small pile of cardstock that you actually use to put interior in vehicles. So it's like a heavy poster board for the most part. It's, you cut it out to fit where you want, and then you can cover it with whatever material you want. Well, this cardstock that I bought was actually finished in a black, you know, some sort of black finishing on it. So I cut it out with the intentions of getting it fit where I wanted. You know, like I said, I needed a headliner, and then I needed that back cab liner. I got everything cut and fit and had intentions of covering it. But once I got it all screwed in place, it actually looked so good in that black finish that that's pretty much how it sits today. And the only thing really left on the interior to finish was the lower door panels. So those, I ended up having enough carbon fiber left over from that big piece that I had mentioned earlier. There was enough of that I was able to do from the upper door panels clear to the bottom of the door. So I just finished out the doors with that so it matched the dash. It actually really turned out pretty good. Really about the only other thing that I ever changed on the interior so far was actually the seat itself. So when I originally put that seat in the truck, the seat frame was basically sitting on the floor. So the seats were bolted down. There was no rise in them at all. And it was super cool. You know, it was Peterbilt cool. So you had the door window was about this level, sitting really low in the truck. You're hanging onto the steering wheel like this. But my knees were up around my ears. It just, it was cool at first. It was not comfortable after about year two. So I ended up building up some 4-inch risers and picking that seat up. And it's a lot more comfortable for me now. Now, phase two of the build. As I used the truck more and more, I, kind of decided that I wanted a little bit more power. The old 350 small cam Cummins, even though I'd done some work to it, a little bit of pump work and a different turbo, it run pretty good, but I really thought that a little more power, that would never hurt, right? I had gathered up a 400 big cam Cummins, and then later on, I had gathered up a set of twin turbos for an NTC 475 Cummins. All of that stuff basically would bolt right onto that big cam Cummins. So my plan was to kind of build up a little bit of a hopped up big cam, bolt that stuff in this truck, and then just have a little bit more power. I had also acquired a 13-speed, thought that might be a good upgrade for the truck as well. And then another thought was maybe stretching the truck out a little bit, because after owning the truck for a couple of years, I actually run across a really pretty clean, period correct Mercury sleeper. Now there was no way I was going to fit the sleeper on there. Even if it didn't have the flatbed there, you're not going to fit that sleeper on that little short stubby truck. So I went ahead and bought the sleeper anyway, had it ratchet strapped out here to a pallet behind the shop to make sure the wind didn't blow it over. And that's actually where the sleeper sat for several years. Well, as I was pondering these changes, I happened across a deal on a basket case truck that was a 67 Peterbilt. And the guy that owned the truck had already started the process of bolting in a B model 3406 Cat, power steering, a 13-speed, and he used the same air ride suspension that I had in my truck. And it was all on a set of longer aluminum frame rails. Well, it turns out he wanted about the same amount of money that he had invested in the engine. So I ended up picking up a complete basket case truck for about $3,500, drug it home, and then started, looking at what we need to do to make this whole process go together. First part of this project was to see if this 3406 actually ran. I was told it was a good running engine that came out of the wrecking yard, and there was no reason to believe otherwise, other than the fact that it actually sat in that wrecking yard long enough that the alkali dirt had ate the bottom of the oil pan to the point that it got thin enough, the weight of the engine buckled the pan and cracked it. Before I actually paid for the engine, I was able to crawl in there and peek through the crack of the oil pan and see that nothing internally the engine was corroded. You know, it wasn't full of mud. There was nothing really. It actually really was pretty clean. Just the bottom of the oil pan was broke open. So I needed to find an oil pan. And then I also knew that if I was going to get this engine in a narrow nose Peterbilt and have it function properly, I was going to have to do something about the charge air cooler. So the engine in question is a 4 1/4 cat, 425 horsepower. And those engines normally run their boosted air from the turbo through an air-to-air cooler in front of the radiator, then back to the intake manifold. I'm not going to go into details of trying to figure out how to get an air-to-air cooler in front of the radiator on a narrow nose Pete, but I knew that there was another option. There were many different horsepower levels of 3406 cat, and a lot of those horsepower levels actually used a water jacket cooler. So it's kind of like a Cummins, where your charge air cooler is actually bolted onto the side of the engine in the intake manifold. Well, while on the hunt for parts, I happened across a 350 horsepower B model cat that was just a core. According to that guy, he said that it ran fine, but it was starting to get coolant in the oil. So he pulled it out, replaced the engine, and he had this core. I picked the unit up for $500. It had an oil pan that I needed, and it had the charge air cooler bolted to the engine with all of the plumbing to go with it. It was a complete engine. So I had everything there to make this 4 1/4 cat work in a narrow nose Peterbilt. So right off the bat, the old oil pan came off. I took the pan off of the core engine, new gaskets, everything to get the pan back on that engine, put good oil in it. While the pan was off, I went ahead and washed the crank and the rods and everything, washed out the whole bottom end, and then put the new pan on, new gaskets, sealed everything up, put fresh oil in it, and it really didn't take a long time, running it off the 5-gallon bucket. I was able to get the engine running. Once I confirmed that I had a good engine on hand, that basket case truck was completely stripped down. Now, when I got it, they had already stripped it down of all the wiring, all the plumbing. There was nothing in the frame rails. He had the frame rails all sandblasted. So the only thing that was actually there was the B model cat with a 13-speed, kind of halfway bolted in. The power steering box had one bolt holding it in place. And then you had the shell of a cab. And that was about it, the front and rear axles. So I moved it over to the other side of the shop, pulled the engine and the transmission out, and then obviously removed the cab before I even got it that far. Made any repairs that it needed. So the left front cab mount had a crack in it. I welded that up, got it all bolted back on, got everything cleaned up, and then I painted that chassis gloss black, just like the 61. Moved that chassis back over here to this side of the shop, and then I started working on stuff with the engine. Swapped all of the water jacket cooler parts from the core engine over to the 4 1/4 cat. I had to get a clutch and everything so I could actually bolt the 13-speed on permanently. And then I built all of the mounting to actually bolt that stuff into the truck. Prior to painting the frame, I had finished mounting the power steering box, which that entailed a little bit of moving some holes around and notching a little bit on that cab mount that I had just welded all the cracks and stuff in. All of it was pretty simple. It was just nuts and bolts. One of the things that I noticed when I started measuring and doing all of this stuff, my original plan was to get this chassis all together with everything bolted in it properly and ready to go. And then I was going to swap my cab and hood, front fenders, everything right from the 1961 over to the 1967 truck. Well, when I started measuring and checking stuff out, I got to noticing that the BBC on these two trucks was different. Now, BBC is bumper to back of cab. So that is the overall length from your front bumper to the back of the cab. My 1961 was a 119 BBC. So that is just a standard hood Peterbilt for that time. This truck here, the basket case truck that I just picked up, was best I could measure right around 124 or 125. I had never even heard of an extended hood, butterfly hood Peterbilt. So I had to do a little bit of research there. I ended up sending the VIN number for the 1967 over to Cam Lavin, which he has access to a lot of information on these trucks. And he come back and confirmed the truck was in fact a 124 1/4 BBC truck. And it turns out the reason that it is that longer extended hood was because it was originally a 1676 Cat V8 powered truck. Now that particular engine it was in a few trucks, but it ended up being kind of a pile of crap for a truck application. Most of those engines were replaced under warranty, and they were either replaced with a 1673, which was a kind of a smaller engine, or they were replaced with the big horse, which was the 1693. Now this basket case truck, the guy I bought it from, when he acquired the truck, it actually still had the 1673, so the little bit smaller one. He removed that one to put the B model in it. So I got an extended hood truck because of this engine. Well, another thing that I got because of this 1676 B8 engine was a 3-screw radiator. So right up here, these 3 screws that hold this side cowl on here, most of these narrow-nose Peterbilt trucks have 2 screws. So they're just referenced as a 2-screw radiator or a 3-screw radiator. All that's indicating is the thickness of the core. So another thing that I scored on this basket case truck was the big thick core radiator. So that was pretty exciting to find out. Once everything was done with the engine and the transmission, all the mounting was done and it was bolted back into the freshly painted frame, I took my 3-screw radiator, took it in the shop, completely disassembled it, rodded out each core, and I had the side frames, made sure they weren't cracked or broken. I had those powder coated. The upper and lower tanks, I also had those powder coated. And then the side shrouds you see there, they were also, I had worn powder coat them as well. So everything in there is powder coated and just cleaned up. Completely rebuilt the radiator, got it all resealed up, bolted it back together with all the powder coated parts. Then that whole assembly was set back in the frame. At that point, I took the cab that came with the basket case truck, set it back on the frame, and I also unpalleted the Mercury sleeper and set it in place as well. Everything got moved back over here to this side of the shop, and I decided to do something different with the front axle. I'm not really sure if that was the original front axle to the 67 or if it was something that the owner I bought it from had swapped in there. I know there were several things that I believe he got from a donor 359. So I think he got the power steering and the 13-speed from a different truck. And I think that might have been where the front axle come from. So more than likely the 67 did not have front brakes on the original front axle. And the front axle that was in the truck when I got it did in fact have front brakes. Now looking at it, it was in really bad shape. The front brakes, the shoes and the drums and everything there, they were considerably older and it looked like they would be very hard to get the parts for that. So what I ended up doing was going over that Battle Mountain to the wrecking yard over there, and I bought a complete front axle assembly out of a newer 359. It was actually a early to mid 80s 359. I bought that axle, I brought it here to the shop, completely stripped it down and rebuilt it. Got all new kingpin bushings, bearings, kingpins themselves, all new brakes, S-cams, wheel bearings, seals, the whole thing got completely disassembled, cleaned. Any machine work that was done. I had that whole assembly. I took it in and had Warren powder coat it. Then I brought it back and reassembled it with all new parts. Then that whole assembly was rolled under the truck. I made some adjustments with the springs themselves. So the front springs on these trucks actually have a bronze bushing in them instead of a rubber bushing. Built all new bronze bushings, put that stuff in the springs. I kind of shuffled some of the leaves back and forth. So it's pretty common for the older Peterbilts to have what they call the Peterbilt lean. And this truck definitely had it. So I ended up shuffling a couple of different leaves around. And it wasn't like I stacked one side to make it tip the other way. I just took like 1 or 2 leaves from this side that might have a bit more arch than this side and move them over, bring these ones here. I just got the truck to where it would sit level. Then I took that basically brand new axle that I have now, slid it under the truck, had new U-bolts built, and bolted everything right in place. While I was under there bolting that stuff in, I went ahead and fabricated some shock mounts because these trucks normally don't have shocks on the front, but this one does now. Now I knew that my hood was not going to work from the 119 BBC or my 1961 Peterbilt, but I still had full intentions of using that cab. So before I swapped the body over, I wanted to get as much plumbing and wiring done as possible. What I did was started with a lot of the air plumbing, just getting stuff routed, and everything just snowballed from there. I ended up taking the air tanks that came with the basket case truck, had those powder coated, got those mounted back in place. I got to thinking, if I could score another set of fuel tanks somewhere, I could bolt them on the frame and then actually plumb the fuel system in. That's just less stuff you have to take from the old truck to put on the new truck. So I ended up picking up a nice set of 23-inch diameter. They're 100-gallon fuel tanks with the hangers, brackets, everything. Got a really good deal on a set of those. Took them in, had them powder coated, bolted them on the chassis. Same with the battery boxes. Like, man, if I could find a set of battery box lids, I could build the box part that hangs on the frame, and then I could put batteries in it and then start doing that part of the wiring. So that's what I did. Grabbed up a couple of lids, the covers for the battery boxes, built new boxes, one for each side, had all that stuff powder coated, bolted on the frame, and then I began, all the heavy wiring. So in short, before too long, I had a whole nother complete truck sitting in here with the exception of the mock-up cab, we'll call it. Everything else was plumbed. Everything else was wired. All I needed to do was swap the cab and the hood over from my 61 over to this truck. Only we knew that the hood wasn't going to work. Now, the hood that I got with the basket case truck was really, really rough. It was rougher than anything on the 61 when I got it. It was beat. So I didn't even make an attempt to try to straighten that out. I did send a few pictures to Cliff and told him I needed him to get busy, and he pretty much laughed at me on that one. So I actually reached out to Cortland over in California and asked them if they would build me these top sections for the hood itself. I didn't want to buy a whole complete hood from them because I knew I could make the side panels myself. I just bought those upper panels and had them roll that edge to fit the cab. Now, I had actually reached out to Cortland to have them build that hood, that section of the hood, as soon as I knew that I was going to need it. I mean, I knew that the truck was different. I knew my hood was junk. So I actually reached out to them probably before I even had the engine and the transmission set back in the frame. They had quite a lead time to build this hood for me. Now, as I continued on and got stuff finished up, eventually it came to the point that I had to swap the cab over to the truck. So what I did was I pulled the 61 in between the two-post lift on the other side of the shop, unbolted what was necessary. I lifted the cab up and rolled the chassis of the 61 out from under the truck and stored it out here in the backyard. I took the chassis that's under the truck now and rolled it out, used the forklift to lift the cab off of it, the mock-up cab and the sleeper, and then I rolled this chassis on in underneath the old original cab that I started with. Really, there wasn't a whole lot to do as far as finishing the cab swap. Everything bolts directly back in place. The wiring was super easy to hook up. I mean, when I did everything on this chassis, I did it in the state of mind that this cab was going on it. So it was all really pretty much plug and play. The only differences I had to make were the steering column is different between a manual steering box truck and a power steering box truck. So I had to change out the steering column. I had to elongate the shifter hole by about 1.5 inches or 2 inches, which required a little bit bigger shift boot. And outside of that, everything else just dropped in place and basically plugged right in. And while I was at it, since now we have the longer frame rails, I went ahead and built mounting and everything to get the Mercury sleeper bolted onto this chassis and be able to use it with this truck. Now, the Mercury sleeper was almost a whole project in itself. When I got that sleeper, it actually come out of some local guys here were doing some scrapping, and they saved it off the back of an old Brigadier mobile home toter. So it had a really nasty, ugly hole cut in the front of the sleeper to fit the big window in the back of that truck. And it was in pretty bad shape. The sleeper itself was in pretty good shape, but the pass-through hole was pretty rough. A lot of the framing in the front of those sleepers is wood. And the reason for that is because there are so many different applications that they could use that sleeper on. The wood just afforded them a lot of variety. They did make a lot of changes very easily. I ended up removing all of that stuff, building aluminum framework. I actually took the window frame out of the back of the donor cab or the basket case cab and used that, riveted it in place so that now the pass-through hole in the Mercury sleeper is exactly the same pass-through as the back of this cab. So it was really easy to line everything up. You know, your pass-through boot and everything fits really nice on both the sleeper and the back of the cab. With the cab now bolted on the new chassis, I rolled that whole truck out of the way, brought the old chassis back in, lifted it up enough to get the rear suspension and the rear axle out of that truck. So the rear differential that was in the 61 was considerably bigger, and it had the 307-to-1 gear ratio. The rear axle that was actually in the 67 was the same suspension, all the same components, but it had a little bit smaller differential, and the gear ratio in that axle was actually 410-to-1. So those got swapped back and forth, and I was able to put enough stuff together driveline wise between what was in the 61 and what I got with the 67 to where I could put a driveline in that truck that would work perfectly. Now, after getting the cab mounted on the frame and the rear axle swapped in there, the next thing that I needed to do was take care of stuff like air cleaners, the piping for the air cleaners, all of that type of stuff. So the 61 had a lubrifiner on the driver's side of the truck, and then it had a passenger side single air cleaner. Well, I had kind of gathered up enough stuff to put dual air cleaners on the truck, and I thought that would look pretty cool. So I went ahead and gathered up another air cleaner housing and had it powder coated to match the original. And then I had to do some modifying on the air cleaner brackets here. These are actually newer 359 air cleaner brackets that I cut and reversed the way they're bent and mount to the cab and made them work with this small window cab. But I got all that done, got all the piping under the hood done. Now we got dual breathers on our little window Peterbilt. So now at this point, I do have a running drivable truck. We actually ended up making the first trip with this truck up to Bonner's Ferry for Mountain Havoc. And we ended up making that first trip with no hood on it because I still hadn't gotten a call that my hood was ready from Cortland. So we made that first trip up to Bonner's Ferry, kind of hot rod style with just the radiator hanging out there and that big yellow cat. Now, I believe it was about 3 weeks after that first trip, I did finally get the phone call from Cortland Truck Works that my hood panels were ready to go. So I ran over to California, I picked those up, and then at the same time, I went ahead and bought enough aluminum that I could build both side panels and the air cleaner panels here. As far as the interior stuff for the Mercury itself, we kept it really pretty basic. I don't need a sleeper to sleep in. We needed more room. So Allison's getting a little bit big for a car seat, and she was getting a little bit big for us to sit 3 wide in this cab here. So what I did was I put a new floor in the sleeper, and then we did simple carpet from just a few inches up on the front, down on the floor, and then it comes up the back of the cab. And then I used the lower portion of a Super Duty bench seat out of a Super Cab. So it's a really short seat bottom that's most of the full width of the sleeper itself. And then it's got all the seat belts and everything in it. So now you can have 2-3 people actually sit on that small bench in the back of the sleeper there. And that's pretty much the purpose that it serves now. Now, I know that's a whole bunch of talking and probably a bunch of pictures that you get to look at. But what we're going to do now is I'm going to grab that camera up, turn it around, and I'll take you over how the truck sits now. You can have a look at what's going on. Maybe I'll remember a few things that I forgot to mention in the whole storytelling that went on beforehand. So this part of the video is actually a couple of days later. I had spent enough time John in the first half of this video that it was actually kind of killing my productivity. So I had to put the camera down and get some work done. And here we are a couple of days later when I really should be doing this part of the video outside in the sunlight, but it's a little late for that. Today's my last day off. I go back to work tomorrow and it's dark out. So we're just gonna have to make do here in the shop in the artificial light. And now we can take a walk around this thing, talk about a few things that I might have forgot to mention while I was sitting in front of it, and just let you guys have a look at it as it sits in its current state. One of the things that I know I forgot to mention already was these shutters right here. So this was actually a pretty big project when it was on the 61. These shutters here actually came off of the 61. And if you see some of my previous videos, you'll see when I come out here and start the truck, these shutters are actually wide open. Now, the way these shutters actually functioned on these trucks back in the day is that is what regulated your engine temperature. Not a thermostat in the engine, but they would actually control the airflow going through the radiator. Now, these trucks have a spring that actually holds those shutters open, and then they would use what they call a shutter stat. And it was a lot like a thermostat, basically just a wax-filled actuator. And when it was cold, when the truck was cold, that actuator would actually force these shutters closed. Then as the engine temperature rose up, they would gradually open the shutters up. And then that was actually how they controlled that airflow. I remember hearing some of the old guys talking about being able to tell how hard a guy was running a truck due to how far those shutters were open. You know, some of them guys that might own a couple of trucks and they were paying somebody to drive them, you know, passing each other on the road. If he saw those shutters wide open, he'd be on the radio telling that guy, better get off the foot feed. Take it a little easy on that truck. I always thought that was kind of comical. Now, these shutters, like I said, these come off of the 61. And once I figured out that they were there and everything but the shutter stat was on that truck, I didn't really want to use them as a way to manage the airflow through the radiator, but I did want them to function. I wanted them to, you know, basically operate at the most basic level possible. So what I did was I ended up adding an air cylinder back here behind this shroud. And the air cylinder itself is just controlling the shutters. They are still set up with a spring that holds them open. So if there's ever, it fails to an open position. So if I ever have a problem with the system, it will actually just go wide open on the shutters. And anytime the shutters actuate, they're either fully open or fully closed. Like right now, the truck is cold, obviously, and it's got a full charge of air. So they're sitting here closed because the truck is cold. So the way I have this system set up is when the engine gets to about 175 degrees, I believe, there is a Kaiser air temperature actuated air switch right up there in the top, one of the water jackets up in the top of the head up there. So what happens is when the engine reaches 175 degrees, it applies air to that cylinder in the side of the radiator there and opens the shutters up. So that is one way that the shutters work. And that's pretty much how they work most of the time. But I also have a solenoid valve here in the supply line to that temperature actuated air switch. So if you do, so this is actually set up so that if you turn the air conditioning on, the shutters will open and allow airflow over the condenser. So I can actually manually stroke this solenoid valve here. And then you guys can see how the shutters open. So anytime the AC comes on or you turn the AC on, the shutters go wide open. It doesn't matter if the truck's 50 degrees, 100 degrees, or almost ready to open themselves. If you don't have the AC on, you drive the truck down the road for a few miles. Once it gets up to 175, they open just like that anyway. And then they pretty much stay open until you shut the truck off and it completely cools down. And then if you notice, there's actually two solenoids here on this. And this one here is for the Horton clutch fan. I actually added that to this engine. This was a direct drive fan when I got this engine. But I added the Horton clutch fan, and then it just turns on by temperature. So that solenoid is controlled by the Caterpillar. There is a Caterpillar temperature switch in the head, and then it just turns it on when it needs the fan. I don't even know what that switch is set at for sure. I believe it's around 200 degrees. I've never seen it come on because anytime I'm pulling a hill, I can turn that solenoid on the dash and engage the fan. And I will usually do that right at the bottom of a hill because if I can keep my coolant temperature cooler in the radiator, it's cooler here in the water jacket cooler. So that helps my pyrometer temperatures. Other notable stuff under the hood here, you can see where I set up the dual breather deal. That's all homemade stuff there to get a breather here on the driver's side and on the passenger side. This reservoir, I've had people ask about this. This is the power steering reservoir, and that came off of an old bus. So I just liked it because it had a big feed and then the sight glass. Always thought that thing was pretty cool. I've got it mounted there on the charge air cooler. I've seen some of the power steering pumps where they have the reservoir on them. I actually looked for one of those, but they're really hard to get. And then some of these trucks, actually, if they don't have dual breathers, they'll have the reservoir out here mounted on the corner of the cab. But I wanted mine all tucked away nice and clean under the hood if possible. I've also got it's a Global Rostra cruise control on this deal. And that system actually works really good. This truck will motor right down the road. You set the cruise and just let it do its thing. That works pretty well. And now I guess I'll go open the other side of the hood, give you a look at that side of the engine. There's not a lot to see on this side of the engine. That is a Borg-Warner turbo off of an E-model Cat. It's a wastegated turbo. Between that and a couple turns out on the fuel screws, this thing will motor down the road pretty good. And the rest of that plumbing for the dual breathers. Everything there. Just really not a lot to see here. AC compressor, good size alternator. Of course, I did have to change the oil cooler right after putting this thing all back together. Something had deteriorated in that oil cooler as it sat over the years. So as soon as I got it running and coolant flowing through everything, I was getting oil in my coolant. So I got to do a big flush on the whole system and change that cooler. Got that all fixed up and haven't had any trouble since then. All of this hood latch stuff is factory stuff that I was able to save from the old hood. They're supposed to have some leather pads that go over this. I've just got a piece of weather stripping clipped on there. It's supposed to be a temporary deal, but here we are years later and I still haven't got around to painting that hood. One of these days I will get it done. But in some of my other videos I'd mentioned about how I taught myself how to do the buck rivet stuff, and that all stemmed from doing this hood. These side panels here, I actually built those myself. Same with the air cleaner panels. The only part that I actually had Cortland do was the top sections of the hood. And the biggest reason for that is like those steel wear strips and getting that curve on there to match the cab here. I don't really have the tooling to do that, and I don't want to do it very often, so I don't need to build the tooling. But as far as these panels here, I rolled that lip in there. That was actually all done with a Harbor Freight bead roller, and I just offset the rollers enough that I could roll that panel through there. And then everything lines up the way it's supposed to. And then obviously, as I'd mentioned earlier, the 3-screw radiator. And that's just indicating that this thing has a thicker core in it, which is a really good deal when you start putting, a bit more power like this Cat has versus something this truck originally would have come with. And I'm running 11 R22.5s all the way around on the truck. These ones here are actually brand new steer tires. I just got those put on the other day. That was one of the things that I needed to get done instead of talking to the camera. So both front tires are new for this year. That's actually why I normally run the lug nut covers on there, but I need to retorque these wheels. But we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. Let's take a look inside. Now this is really probably where I should have done this part of the video outside. The truck's just so dark inside. I do have a work light in the sleeper, so maybe you guys can see some of this stuff. So as I'd mentioned, these door panels, these are all 16 gauge steel, built to fit all of the stuff that's in the truck. Also the bear claw latches that I'd mentioned before. Those things just make it so much nicer with this truck. Normally these would be pointed forward. I just did them down because I wanted to. I guess a little different than everybody else does. Also, this is the latch for inside the truck, and it's just super simple setup. Can't really beat it. Carbon fiber door panels, so they just continue on from here down to the bottom of the door. And then another thing that's kind of odd with this truck, especially guys that know trucks, the peep window in the driver's door, that is not normal. That's not something that you would do. Some of these trucks would have a vent there, possibly, especially a cab over. So these doors were actually used on, I believe they were the 361 cab overs. I'm not sure on the model number of the cab over for the Peterbilts. But it was the earlier cab overs. They used that door all the way into the 80s on the cab over Pete's. And some of these doors would have had a vent there. Now the reason that this door has a peep window in the front of the door here is because it's really common for this strap right here to break, your door limit strap. That breaks or it pops out of the door, and then you end up with dents in the door right there. So the door that came off of the truck, remember I mentioned I had to get this door. I actually had my dad get this door. He was on a road trip somewhere and run across a place that had a bunch of parts, and I was in the market. He ended up bringing this one back for me. The door that was on the 61 was beat. It was rough. It had been into the lubrifiner, which the lubrifiner is just another case on here. It's a big filter, an oil filter that's mounted similar to this right in this location. Well, that thing the door had slapped the lubrifiner enough that it was in pretty bad shape. And then this door here looked really good until I got it home. And then somebody had body worked in where it had done the same thing. Not nearly as bad as the 61, but it was still pretty rough. We worked on straightening it out a little bit. Cliff was gaining ground, and I said, why don't we just put another peep window in it? I had the framework, so this little rivet in piece right here. I had that part, and once you get it riveted in there, you know, where it kind of stretched the material a little bit, basically I cut out anything that was damaged and stretched. And then we were able to rivet that framework in there and took a door with a couple of little dents in it and made it pretty much perfectly straight. So yeah, it's kind of odd that it has the peep window on both sides of the truck, but it took care of the dents without really having to work on them too hard. Now back inside the truck, as I'd mentioned, the steering column, I had to change it once I swapped over to this chassis here, this powertrain. And that's because the original 61 steering column is part of the box. So it's actually mounted on the inside of the frame rail there. And then on this truck, you can see the steering box is right there on the outside of the frame rail. And it's got a little jack shaft that's in there, kind of at an angle, comes up right into a U-joint in this bell. So I had to change that. I also had to change the clutch. So the original 61 actually come through a hole right here, which I've got it covered up. And this cab actually had the hole for the clutch pedal down here. So I was actually able to not have to modify the cab any. It just, unfortunately, my carpet has the remnants of the old truck there. And before we climb up in there, got the Super Duty seats with that seat belt that I was talking about. And then my seat risers that save my knees. And this is actually a power seat, so it's adjustable, and the key power's on, you can adjust it. However, it's pretty much right up against the back of the cab, and there's no need to go any farther forward. I would climb on up in here, and you can kind of see that carbon fiber dash. This insert right here is what I was talking about with the, normally they're a wood grain finish. This one here is all carbon fiber. Halfway across the cab here. And then all my carbon fiber gauges. That's the tack that's been with this cab since the beginning. And then this is a bit newer speedometer here now. This is actually an electronic speedometer. Reads off a pickup on the back of the transmission. And then I've kept the original wigwag. So your low air indicator. As you can see, that's holding itself in place because it has over 100 pounds of air in it. So once the air goes down to about 60 pounds, that thing will fall down from under the cab there. Stereo, and then of course your CB radio. Then not a lot else in here. It's pretty sparse. I mean, we've got carpet, try to keep it nice. Allison's actually been in here about half the afternoon today cleaning this thing up, get it ready for our next trip. She's got it looking pretty nice. Guess I can go ahead and turn some power on here. So you got main power, and that kicks everything on in the truck. And you can see there's all the switches on this side. You got, you know, your headlights, park lights, dome light, Used to have a fuel switch so I could switch between tanks, but now I've actually got the two tanks teed together to go into the primary fuel screen. You can turn the fan on, that engine fan, from in here. And then you can dump the suspension, drop it. I used to have the original fan that was on the dash. I actually still have the fan. I just had it in the truck. We had taken it apart, had most of it powder coated, polished the fan blades. It was all pretty cool. But when we started towing around a 48-foot trailer, I found that this cheapo backup camera works really good for seeing what's going on behind that trailer. So it's actually on one of the fan switches. You can see that thing is actually really nice. And then I'd mentioned earlier that this thing has got electric windshield wipers now. And these are actually the location where the factory knobs would have been for the wiper motors. So you would turn a knob here and that wiper over there would move. And then same, this one here would operate this wiper. I have them now set up to where they're actually high and low. So that's your low wiper and it just runs both of them. You hit the other switch and you get high. And then of course they've got their own park position as well. It's the little things, right? And then one of the other things that really gets people's attention is my shift knob. See if I can get you guys to where you can see what's going on here. I might bring that light from behind me and set it up so you can see what's going on real quick. So my shift knob here is actually a control knob out of a Bobcat skid steer. So it's normally you would have your different functions on it. And I thought it was super convenient because you have all of these switches right here at your fingertips when you're driving on the road. So I actually have these set up. This paddle switch is for my blinkers. And I'm also using I can't remember the brand, but it's a blinker controller that's all solid state. So you can flick the switch like that and you'll get a certain number of blinks, or it will actually blink for a certain number of seconds. You can hold the switch one way and it will blink for a longer amount of time, or you can cancel it. And then these two switches here are actually for your transmission control. So you've got your range selection here. So you're go through the low side gears and then you'll flip here and you'll be on the high side of the transmission. And then the splitter is here on this side. Then I've got, you can see over here, the indicator let you know. So say you're go through the high side all the way up to high gear, and then you'll hit this. If it's going down the road and the transmission has shifted into the high side, once you hit that, you'll know that you're in the overdrive side of the transmission. And if the range side has actually shifted, that will stay there. And then the last part of the shifter is actually the trigger down here, and of course that's for the horn. Down below the dash, you got the vintage air here. And then about the only thing left is the glove box. And this is that piece I was talking about, has all the ducting built into it off the top of the vintage air. Direct stuff where it needs to go. Got a couple other vents down under the dash here for blow the AC on your shins when you need it. And then there's some, like in the kick panels down there, there's actually vent controls. You can see those, that lever sticking out there. You can actually open vents behind the air cleaners there. Let a little fresh air in once in a while. I guess we'll take you back in Allison's compartment in the sleeper. And that is, got the pass through here, but we'll go in through the side door there. Give you a look-see at that. The vast majority of the old Mercury sleeper here is pretty stock. The only thing I really did was, it was a terrible, ugly white color. I stripped the paint off of it. And the sleeper is just beat up enough to fit really good with the truck. It's got a couple of battle scars, a couple of dingers here and there, but nothing that's really worth fixing as far as the exterior goes. Now the interior, as I had mentioned, this thing had a great big hole in it, and all of this wood, like the interior wood here, this stuff was really bad shape. And actually this bead board was actually just really easy to get a hold of. and make the repair with that. I kind of wished I would have done something different now, but it's in there. I mean, it's really not hard to take out and replace it. But the rest of the wood, other than, you know, kind of, it looks like water stained, like something's been sprayed in here. Who knows? Who knows how long it sat kind of open. The wood itself is actually in pretty good shape. It's pretty structural. It's not mushy or anything like that. Allison and I were actually talking today. We might mask paper off all of this stuff and let her repaint the inside. We're just kind of deciding if we should paint it, you know, do like a Kills type primer and then paint it. I really think that I would like to find some kind of really dark stain and then stain this wood, get it as dark as we can, kind of to match the interior of the front part of the truck. But I mean, that's kind of down the road, no rush for that. As far as the rest of it, like I said, this is just a Super Duty, early 2000s Super Duty seat. I did have to build new bases for it to work the way we wanted, but we can fold them up if you need a little more room in there for something, or they fold down. Allison's plenty comfortable sitting in here. She's got her lap belts in there. The carpet is actually just a big rug I bought from Walmart. It's got this aluminum trim piece that holds it up here. Got it tucked down in the front corner there. I did replace the floor when I was kind of prepping this thing to go on the truck. The aluminum floor in it was in pretty beat up. I mean, it's solid. Structurally, it's good, but you could tell that this thing, normally a Mercury sleeper at that band right down there, from that level down would be storage. And then from that level up, they would just have a mattress. You would be able to climb in here and go to sleep. Obviously, that whole level came out. And then you could tell this floor was pretty beat up, probably from chains and rigging and jumper cables and who knows what tools and parts rode around in this thing for how many years. So it's kind of a little bit saggy, kind of a little bit beat up. So what I did was actually took a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and cut it to fit in here. And then, you know, let it settle in the corners where everything was still straight and flat. And then actually pulled that aluminum floor up to that piece of plywood. So this thing is actually super solid now. These brackets here, this is actually the seat belt mounts to all of this stuff. So I wanted it really rigid. Those things, that's why they're made out of 1/4 inch plate. And they're actually sandwiched to big bulkhead plates underneath the floor. So this thing is pretty solid. If a person was to ever get in a wreck in one of these trucks, you're pretty much kind of hosed anyway. You know, there's really no structure to them as far as a rollover accident. But the way this sleeper is actually on the truck, Allison probably has the best odds of survival of any of us. With any luck, this whole box would go tumbling off in the sticks and she would just be strapped in it. The rest of the truck would probably take a pretty bad hit. Probably just better off if we don't crash, you know. This sleeper still has all the original latches and stuff in it, this sliding bar style latch, but they all actually work pretty good. At least this main door and then the upper door on the other side. The lower one on the other side, you do kind of have to hold it just right and, you know, hold your tongue just right to get it to latch the first try, but it works out pretty good. The mounting for the sleeper is actually 4-inch, 1/4 inch aluminum, and there's 2 pieces to make it into a Z channel. So this inside piece actually goes over the frame rail, and then they're huck bolted together with these 3 big channel brackets here. And that's probably actually overkill for what most of these trucks had. Most of them might have had 2. That would have been about it. The rubber bushings, I'm not even sure what the rubber bushings are from. They were just some that I had in a box in the shop. They seem to do pretty good. If you're going down a pretty bumpy road, you can see the sleeper looks like it's pretty cozy. It's got a little bit of its own bounce to it. This part here, this box is actually, that's a new addition. Just got it done today. This is actually a fuel tank. So this is where we're going to be hauling our methanol for the monster truck. So I didn't really want to do a steel or aluminum fuel tank on the truck because Methanol inherently draws moisture to it, so it can lead to corrosion. I didn't want to deal with rust or corrosion in an aluminum tank, so I bought one of these. It's just a Temu or eBay plastic tank. We'll see how long the pump lives with methanol. However, the tank should last a long time. We'll give it a whirl. That's a 50-gallon tank, so by the time I get, a full barrel in there, I'll have about enough to top off one of my gas cans, and we should be good for a show or two with that amount of fuel. And as I had mentioned, this has got the Airliner air ride suspension. I don't know what differential this is. I think it's a Rockwell 186E if I remember the tag number, but I don't know what it's rated for weight-wise or any of that. I just know it's a pretty dang big differential in there. It's got 16.5 by 8.5 wide brakes. So they're kind of an odd brake, the odd size. The diameter is normal, but like a 16.5 by 7 is pretty common for the older stuff. So this being 8 or 8.5 wide shoes, that's kind of odd. Rear bumper, or yeah, the rear hitch assembly, that's all homemade with this setup. Again, another solenoid valve back here on the load leveling valve. So all that's doing is you can apply air to that port and that just dumps the suspension. That's really super handy hooking up to the stuff that I've got around here. I'm really, really glad for that setup. Now, one of the things that a keen Peterbilt guy would probably notice is I've referenced this as a Peterbilt 351, only it only has one rear axle. So that's the difference between a 281 and a 351 is the tandems, or a 289 and a 359. A 289 is a single axle truck, where a 359 is a tandem axle truck. Now there are some, like 281 or a 289 or a 288, that would have two rear axles, but one would just be a tag axle. So it's not a live axle, it's not a drive axle of any type. It is just a tag axle. Now this truck here is a 351. It was originally a tandem axle truck. So when this suspension here was installed, it was replacing, I don't remember the exact brand or the exact style of suspension that was on here. It was kind of like a camelback leaf spring setup that was based around this big cross member that was in here. And it was a tandem axle truck. So the front tires were, up in this area, and then the rear tires were actually probably just a little bit farther back than this set right here. However, this truck is now single axle. I do get people that ask on occasion, how come I don't put tandems under it? But the bottom line is I'm already borderline running more tires than I need as it is. For what we haul and what we do, 99% of the time, one set of tires and one axle does everything that I need to do. Now, there is the very rare occasion that I would really like to have another axle and another set of airbags on the back of this truck. For example, when I hauled that crane home, this one set of airbags just almost did not want to pick that trailer up off the ground with that crane on it. So since then, I've actually picked up what they call a Joe Dog, which is a removable tag axle for the most part. Basically, all it does is pin into your fifth wheel. It's got its own fifth wheel, and then it has got another set of airbags and another axle, another set of brakes. You got another set of duals. It's kind of like a Jeep, like a jump Jeep or a little dolly. The difference is the Joe Dog actually fits in around your frame of your truck. A lot of them actually have a setup that bolts to the back of the truck or as part of this assembly back here. So when you're trying to back up your trailer or anything like that, you don't have this, second axle in there trying to do its own thing. It's basically kind of like just an extension of the frame of your truck, and you get more capacity on it. I've actually got one of those sitting out in the backyard. That's kind of an upcoming project because it's going to need a bit of a restoration. But it is, as far as I can tell, period correct for the truck, so it should actually be a really cool project. And the very few times that I actually need that thing will be really handy to have that and use that with that truck. As for that crusty old set of Alcoas that I had mentioned in the first part of the video, they actually got replaced with a brand new set of Accurides here a couple of years ago. And even though they were brand new and shiny and polished, they still got sandblasted and powder coated that satin finish black to match the rest of the truck. Now I know that look isn't for everybody. I know most of the old truck guys really like their chrome stacks and bumpers and polished wheels and fuel tanks, but you know, this truck definitely has a unique look to it, and I think I'll just keep it the way it is. Other upcoming projects for this thing, I actually want to take this section right here. You can see how far away the seat is from this side of the sleeper. And what I actually want to do is kind of build a little cubby or a compartment in here and put another heater AC unit in that cubby. So you'll have a little bit of storage here that is accessible from outside the truck, and then have a heater AC unit for Allison back in the sleeper. It's like if we travel somewhere in the cold time of year, it gets kind of chilly back in here with, you know, relying on the heater in the cab to blow through that little window opening. Same in the summer. It gets considerably warmer in the sleeper than it is in the cab. So everything in the truck is kind of set up for dual climate control, I guess you'd call it. So I need to get around to utilizing that. I've actually got, you know, 2 sets of heater valves on the engine, the second set designated for the sleeper, and then the AC system, I've actually looped the lines back under the cab to where I can tee into those and run a second evaporator inside that sleeper. And then also, you know, when I put the engine and stuff in the truck, I used a 7-piston sand compressor, and then the condenser here behind the shutters is actually out of a 71 Lincoln Continental. So it's a pretty big condenser that's in that. Well, that's pretty much going to cover it for old Project Pete here. Hopefully, you know, you guys got all the information that you could ever imagine you wanted to know about this old truck. I was actually going to do a little piece on the end of this video about doing the service on this truck, you know, for 2026. However, I do think the video is getting pretty long by now. I haven't even started editing, but I'm just kind of guessing here. Besides that, the way I ended up servicing the truck was kind of ass backwards from how I would normally do it. You know, most of the time I'm gonna dump the oil while the oil is draining, crawl all over the thing and hit all the greasers, adjust your brakes, check all your boxes. Then once the engine's done draining, you're gonna swap your engine oil filter. And surprisingly, I've never really had to change the fuel filters on this thing in the amount of time I've run it so far in this configuration. However, this time I did. I pulled the primary fuel screen that's in between the 2 tanks there, and then ended up changing the fuel filter. But what I ended up doing actually was changing these front tires. I had to pull the, you know, the wheels and everything off the truck, change out the tires. And since I had the tires off, that's when I kind of did all the greasing and checking everything, adjusting the brakes on the front of the truck. With those things out of the way, that job is a lot easier. Well, I did all of that before I even changed the oil in the truck. So I did that part, and then that gave me the opportunity to drive the truck to town, you know, since I had the tires off, I bolted them back on, torqued the wheels. Now I could drive it to town, fuel up the fuel tanks, which makes it easier for priming the fuel filters, plus build a little bit of heat in that engine and the engine oil, which makes that drain better. Then when I come back to the shop here, I was able to retorque those lug nuts and get started on the PM itself, you know, the oil change and all of that stuff. So just everything was kind of messy. I did get a little bit of footage of doing some of that stuff with the intent of putting that part of the video together, but I think it's kind of a waste of time. I could definitely see some more content coming from this truck, just the projects. As I had mentioned, I want to do a heater and AC in the sleeper. That might be something we do in the near future. Also, the Joe Dog. I'm really looking forward to putting that thing together. I think that's going to be a fun project. So I will definitely video that and kind of cover what I do and everything that we have to go through to get that thing up to snuff and ready to use with this truck. However, that's pretty much going to do it for this video. As always, thanks for watching and have a good one. That engine. It was actually, those old Cumminses were kind of known Cumminses. What the heck kind of word is that?